Hello and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Catalin Dumitras and I'm a solutions architect at Pentalog. I've been with the company for about 6 years now, and today I'd like to share with you my thoughts regarding technical debt. Now, a disclaimer, these opinions are my own and they're based on my personal experience. If you do have any feedback or you'd like to share your own opinion with us, please fill the feedback form that will be shared with you after this presentation. Now, without further ado, let's take a look at the contents that we have for today. I'm going to share some slides with you. I'd like you to tell me if you can see them. Can you see the main slides? Awesome. So today we're going to be talking about why should we care about technical debt? What is technical debt exactly? Why does it appear? How do we mitigate it once it does appear? And how do we prevent it in the first place? Now, chances are that up until now, you've found yourself in situations where something was holding you back from delivering results. If I had to personally describe the feeling, it's like swimming against a strong current. Obviously, something is counterproductive and you instinctively know that it could or should be better. So why should you care? I guess the best way to describe this or to answer this question is to talk about the common effects technical debt has. So let me start by sharing with you some questions that I regularly use to identify technical debt and point out some of the negative effects it has. Do you find yourself under constant stress? Now, I'm not talking about being a bit out of your comfort zone. I'm talking about constant firefighting. The type of thing that if your phone is ringing and it's somebody from work, the first thought that goes through your head is, man, what happened this time? Another good question to ask yourself is there a fear of change in your teams? Now, usually this happens because historically any change in a particular place or an area has a very high chance of causing some severe issues, right? I'm talking about big production bugs, even downtime events. So it's the type of thing you don't forget easily. Now, good example of this is when you spot developers going to extreme and sometimes ridiculous lengths to avoid touching an area of code. That happened more than once for me. So now, what if you're in charge of quality assurance? I've got a very good one for you now. If your main goal is quality assurance and you constantly feel that no amount of pre-release testing can discover those significant bugs, that's a clear sign that you're dealing with some big technical debt. What about leadership positions, right? What if you're a leader inside your organization and you're seeing low morale across the team? I'm not just talking one or two people, it's spread everywhere. Usually this comes packaged, so to speak, with decreasing results or velocity. Regardless if you add more people or even if you give them more more time. It's a bit counterintuitive. So the constant here seems to be quality getting worse over time. If one of or more of these signs are part of your experience, you probably are affected by technical debt. Now, there's another very clear sign, and this happens through the best indicator, the best KPIs out there, your customers. If after a release, you are flooded constantly from your support channels, being your service desk or your customer support or wherever it is, it's a clear sign that quality is degrading and you need to take actions. So, who does it affect? Now, obviously, it affects the clients because it's lower quality. If clients are unhappy, they leave. So it affects shareholders because it affects profits. It affects your C-suits like your CEO, your CFO, and it affects everybody in the organization delivering that product. So I guess what I'm saying is it affects pretty much everybody. Okay, so let's take a small step back and see what technical debt really is. Now, technical debt was first used, a term that was first used by Ward Cunningham. You might know him as the creator of the wiki and as one of the authors of extreme programming. He used it in 1992 to describe the issue to non-technical stakeholders, business people, people with great financial experience. So he used the metaphor because that allows you to invest early, but can also be very dangerous if it's not kept in check. All right. So let's try and visualize this a bit. A simple loan without any interest or anything is you take $10, you pay back $10. And when you talk about technical debt, most people think it's like that. It's like the principle in finance. You take $10, you give back $10. Now, people with a bit more experience say that's realize it's a bit more like interest. So it's simple interest. You have 1%. You give back 10 plus that 1%. But actually, what people are finding it's that it's a compound interest, right? So it gets greater and greater over time. It's a problem that can very easily start incrementally and spiral out of control. Now, a different approach to actually discussing about this topic is by Declan Wheelham and Chris Chapman from Lean Into It. They've seen that people are getting much too comfortable with the terminology of debt, and they feel that we should describe it differently. So in their view, and I agree with them, technical debt is a symptom of unhealthy systems. So if you get no reaction when using financial terms in your conversation with your colleagues, it might be worthwhile to switch to health terms instead. Maybe they'll be more sensitive. So let's explain it in a very, very simple way. Let's give the nutshell. Technical debt, in essence, is a series of bad decisions with an exponential effect over time. Now let's take a look at some of the most common types of technical debt. We'll have design and architectural debt. We'll have the code debt that we're most familiar with. We'll have testing them, and also we'll have documentation there. Let's take a closer look at each one. Now, design and architectural ones. First, I'd like to discuss about shortcuts, right? It's either one of the most common human traits, a bit of laziness, or people being very stretched out and not being able to produce quality. Or we're talking about early over-engineering without having specifications, the sort of thing that you'd build a whole solution on with just the project type, right? And then we have something like suboptimal solutions when we have specifications. We play fast and loose, and we don't think about things in the proper depth. Now, specifically with the suboptimal solutions, there's a thing that I've heard talked about, and it's called the shiny new thing syndrome, right? A wonderful new technology is being hyped all over the place. Everybody's getting very, very anxious and happy about it. They want to try it out. Now, a word of caution here. Shiny new things, however much we love them, have no place in a product. They should be part of proof of concepts where we validate their usefulness, where we test out their limitations, and thoroughly explore what use cases are best suited. Only after this amount of research can we actually have the right knowledge to use that new technology in our day-to-day life. So another type is the one we're all too familiar with, the code one. You know, the classic workarounds that solve an issue and create two more at the same time. The code duplication, and this is easy to spot, obviously, the large complexity in our software, and overall general bad practices. The good news here is that there are a lot of tools out there that help you in finding and quantifying what debt you have here. What about testing? Now, usually these are split into a couple of subcategories. We have projects with no test plan or no automation at all. People have always chosen to invest in manual testing, manual regression. And what can I say about this? I mean, what happens when a tester or a group of testers have to do increasing amount of tests within the same time, right? As the features keep on building. I don't think they can magically do the double the amount of work they did a month ago. Not to the same standard anyway. So, yeah. There's also another type. We have a small number or a number of unreliable tests. Obviously, however good automation is, if we can't trust it, its value added is very small. Let's talk about the documentation one. People have usually never really discuss about this or are aware that you can have technical debt in documentation as well. You can have projects with no documentation at all. You can have projects with word of mouth documentation. And that's when a person in your team is like the Bible of that system or that application or that area of the application. You can have out-of-date documentation. It doesn't help you much if it's from 2 years ago. Obviously, things are moving very fast in today. And one of the most weird ones is Unshared documentation. People might be hard at work, building very good documentation, schematics, details, API calls, examples, but nobody knows about them. So there's no real process to share them. There's no time or interest to actually discuss about them or present knowledge to other people. I've seen a bunch of colleagues over the years that, and actually non-technical people, that have heard the saying, the code is the documentation. I feel some people misunderstand this. When a developer says that, they mean that all the code is well documented, either inside the code, I mean, comments, annotations, good variable names. It has pretty much no technical debt, right? It's basically a work of art. It's most likely a pet project, a proof of concept or something, or usually not a real working application in production. Those are like unicorns. They're pretty rare. Right, so this brings us to a thing that's called the reinforcing loop of costs. What it is that it's a loop that produces an action which increases more of the same thing. So I think a very good example of this is documentation. Let's say that you have, you're in a project with word of mouth documentation, right? So you have a key person that knows everything about that system and everybody else is depending on them. Obviously, in a system like that, there's probably some other deficiencies. Over time, the performance decreases and so does morale. Inadvertently, people end up leaving. And if that person, the person that holds the deepest knowledge about that part of your system leaves, besides having to hire new people, you are not forced to discover that knowledge, right? So without having those processes, it all leads back to the same place. All right, so we discussed a bit about technical debt, but let's see how it's actually being created, right? What are the reasons behind this? I think we should start with the unavoidable reasons, right? So these are usually legal reasons. What comes to mind most recently is GDPR. Or you could substitute GDPR with a contract that will expire if you don't fulfill a clause by a certain date or something of that manner. Then you could have a strategic reason. You could need to be first in the market or to differentiate between yourself and the competition before a financial round of the investors. And this could be a very, very significant make it or break it moment. Something along the same lines are tactical short term, right? So think about this as P1 priority issues in production. You're running e-commerce store and your checkout is failing, right? These should immediately be fixed because your company is losing money by the minute. Obviously, it should be immediately followed by a correct fix, something that's up to standards. Then there's incremental reasons, right? It's a lot of small shortcuts. It's something like small credit card debt, if I were to use financial terms. They're very insignificant if you take them in isolation, individually, but added up, they can really be a problem. Now, then there's the unintentional ones, right? So the unintentional ones is bad practices or lack of experience. Obviously, your team need to have a set of standards and technical leaders that mentor people. And regarding incremental and unintentional ones, Um, Business will usually not object to taking shortcuts to deliver on a specific date. But if there are any issues, they will complain about the loss of quality. And usually the arguments are something to the lines of everything you guys deliver should be of good quality, right? So that's a very strong and important point of view. Everything you deliver should be of good quality. Another very common reason for adding technical debt seems to be bad communication. Now, non-technical people are usually not aware of the downsides of adding technical debt. It's very hard for them to comprehend this. Or sometimes they don't trust the practices in place. And what I mean by that is that they don't trust those practices to correctly balance the business needs with the technology needs. And you'll often hear them say that they don't understand why they have to spend resources in what I call non-business value work. It's a subject that I'll get back to shortly. So, when can you add technical debt? Right? If we had to group them, it would be using the same financial terms as ROI stands for return on investment. So basically, if you have positive return on investment or a negative one, right? So positive means that, for example, for an unavoidable reason, you're not going to get fined by the authorities, which can sometimes be millions of tens of millions of euros or dollars. Strategic, securing a customer base or a funding round can be critical to your organization. Tactically, you can stop bleeding money. If these are not fulfilled, right, if you don't incur that technical debt, there are real and quantifiable losses to the business, and these outweigh the value that we'll be creating by waiting to deliver within the normal standards and processes that we have, right? Now, for the negative return on investment, these are reasons that will never return more value, even if we would have paid the debt, as in refactoring, fixing everything up, immediately after in the next iteration, right? So it would never work out in your best interest. I think a good side note to discuss about here is the context of a startup or a greenfield proof of concept, and even in a bigger organization. If you have to make some strategic decisions, even if it incurs technical debt, but allows for a rapid time to market, well, rapid time to market means you have very early feedback from your customer base, from your business partners, and it can very quickly turn out in your advantage, right? So it's all right as long as you make it clear to all the stakeholders that this is not the product you are going to be going forward with, if the product is to be continued with, right? If you move forward with, you have to rewrite it the right way with maybe some lessons learned. You have to refactor things. There's going to be costs to it. You cannot start sprint number 2 with new features, and this has to be clear to everybody in the organization. Now, if the project doesn't continue, I think it's acceptable to do some small changes and shelve it and move on to something else. Now, this approach obviously only works if people are being honest. If people try to hack the process, try and bypass the need for a rewrite and continuously request small changes every day, or every sprint without sharing the full scope. It's the type of situation where the technical leadership in your team or company needs to have the authority to refuse to push back, because it's definitely against the interests of the company. All right. So how do we actually mitigate technical debt? I think it's one of the hardest topic. Obviously, there's no project without some form of technical debt. Or if it is, I haven't seen it yet. So I think first we should talk about how do we invest our time, because firefighting constantly is not the solution. We should try and split our investment, our time, into mitigation and prevention. But to the degree of which you choose one or the other, it depends on your unique situation. So I would say that a 50-50 split is ideal, but you have to adapt and work from there. So let's take a look at a strategy that I think adds value to mitigating technical debt. Now, first thing when you discover an issue or you have an issue like this is to try and do a root cause analysis. I believe this, I've heard about it quite interestingly put in Amazon's leadership principles, where they say that when they do root cause analysis, they usually have to ask the question of why is it failing, or why is this problem happening about 5 times. Now, obviously, not every system out there is as complex as theirs, but it is worthwhile not stopping at the first why. Why are we having this issue, right? So maybe it's not because the code is necessarily bad. Maybe that there's some dependencies, or there's a bad process, or people are wasting a lot of time doing different kind of manual tasks when they should be focusing on something else, but they can't. Once you found out the root cause of the issue at hand, you need to make a decision, right? If I were to group the decision types, I would say they fit into the following categories: experimentation, containment, and reimplementation. Now, the reimplementation or redevelopment is pretty easy. It's when you refactor things, when you even scrap a service or a microservice and re-implement it from scratch. That's pretty much clear cut. But what do we mean about containment? I think that when we're trying to contain an issue, our main goal is to stop the problem from growing. Think back to our compound interest graph. So we should try and postpone any planned development in that area for that specific component, be it a class or a service, or refuse code changes when possible. We don't want to add more problems there, right? And then to contain it, we should start building some form of barrier around it with some sort of testing. Now, depending on how big or small the issue is, right? Big or the component, be it a function, a class, a microservice, will pretty much determine the type of automation test you use, right? Maybe a unit, integration, acceptance. The goal here is to reach a coverage level that will give your team the confidence to make bold changes in the future. So it's building up a capability and not doing the change immediately. Yeah. One very interesting type of approach is experimentation. I've very rarely seen people do this in production environments. So let's take a closer look at what experimentation in that context means. This whole started with a GitHub project called Scientist. The basic story for it is that they had a legacy system dealing with user roles and permissions, and there was a lot of technical debt there. They had the need of refactoring it, but they didn't have the confidence to do it at all. They didn't really understand the full scope. They were worried about not just having bad code, but bad data. And they just decided to experiment. And what I mean by that is they run the old code and the new code in production at once, right? They compare the results of the old and the new code, and they register metrics to see what type of situation exists, out there in the wild. So here we have a very good simple example regarding this. They use the old code, the check user, and then they try out the new functionality the user can. I really encourage you to take a look at this. You'll find on that page ports to most popular languages. So if you're not a Ruby fan or whatever, you're pretty much covered. And this provides a very, very good platform to start experimenting and finding out things about your system, your legacy system. So I just want to give some clarity about how this tool works, or this concept really. You have two code branches, the legacy one and your new refactored code that are being executed. And only the legacy code gets returned or actually used further on, but both results, both metrics are being compared and published to some data store. And obviously there's some caveats with this, right? You can't use it on code with side effects. So anything that writes, anything that deletes, anything that moves stuff around, stuff like that. But hey, you should be having your logic and your writes and reads totally separate. But things are imperfect in the wild, and of course it will add some overhead. You're running two branches of code for the same task. You are responsible for what and where you store. They provide some methods for this, but you have to think about where you want to put those things. Something like a NoSQL store might be best suited. And obviously, don't forget to clean up after your experiments once you've had enough information to take a decision about where you want to go. So if we're talking about change, I'd like to share with you a checklist regarding changes for reducing technical debt, right? So as I've stated before, you should always try to fix the root cause of bugs, not just the symptom of it. For whatever you do, please do try and create and maintain documentation, right? Have a process to share that. It can be as easily as discussing about it in your dailies, or maybe as a knowledge sharing presentation. Try to automate wherever possible. I like to think that if technical debt is having to pay stuff with exponential increases of work, automation is the exact opposite, right? So you do the work once and it pays you dividends over and over and over again, right? I'd like to share with you some things about refactoring, and this is something that you'll have a lot to do. Obviously, it's one of the main things you have to do to tackle technical debt. But there's a trap out there, right? And us as engineers always fall into it sometimes. We try and build the perfect system. obviously, that's rarely possible. And we should try to replace that solution with a better one, even if it's not perfect. We should probably not invest into systems that are being replaced in the short term. So anything that's being shelved in a couple of months would fit that bill. And as a good practice, do cleanup releases, right? If you had to ship a big feature or feature set, obviously you're going to learn some lessons. If you get into the habit of doing cleanup releases, it's going to be a lot more easy to maintain quality over time. Next is a topic I've been telling we're going to be cycling back to. I've noticed a trend in communication and the relationship between non-technical people and technical people. Usually non-technical people approach the technical department as a provider, right? So they view it as a provider and not as an integral piece. And using it as a metaphor, I think this is the best way I can showcase this, right? So a provider is somebody that offers you a commodity. It's something that's easily replaced, right? And your business value is, totally separate, right, from that provider's value. But actually, and I think most of you would agree with me, IT is pretty much integrated into everything right now. It's actually become the foundation. So we need to find the right way to communicate with non-technical people and to build the right relationship. So naturally, people push things that they don't understand aside. And when it comes to non-business value work, I'd like you to share with them that there is no such thing as non-business value work, because if we didn't think it had value, we wouldn't have been doing it. It might not have immediate value in the short term, but if we look into the future, into the medium and the long term, it allows us to do things faster, sometimes cheaper, to improve our processes and be competitive for hiring. Now, all of this needs to be explained in a common language that the other party understands. So people need a common vocabulary that allows for effective communication between the two sides. Obviously, we should always give visibility to them. We should discuss the deterioration of our system. We should not keep that information for ourselves. And we should definitely remind them when they're informed, that we were informed about issues or risks after those problems happen, because this is mostly like a training. It's like you're conditioning people to understand the cause and effect of not tackling these situations early. So the main point I have here is that what we call technical debt management in our own jargon is actually risk management in business jargon. So we want the same thing, we just have to find a common way of expressing it. And to that end, I have a tip for you. Never start the talk with technology. That's what we're passionate about. Start with the why. Start with the business reason. And I'll try and give you a very simple example, right? We want to do infrastructure as code and continuous integration. It's something that everybody wants to do, and hopefully you already have that in your own projects. But people glance over when they're non-technical and they don't understand what this means. So I say phrase it differently. Start with the why. And bear with me here because it's going to be a mouthful. Maybe you should try saying something like this. To implement the CEO's vision, of doubling the size of our team this year, we need some capabilities, right? We need infrastructure as code, so we can provision environments fast for the new teams and implement cost savings. And we need continuous integration because it allows us to get features in production fast. Try and estimate some numbers here so they can understand the value that this adds. Sometimes things don't go as easy, and you discuss one thing and you find yourself in sprint planning and you feel like the whole purpose has shifted, right? You're no longer doing the things that matter, you're doing something else. Well, that's the right moment in time where you should try and raise this up. But again, don't do it from the technical perspective, try and do it from the business goal, right? Come back to the same goal, right? The CEO stated that that's the main goal, right? Why are we prioritizing something trivial like some coupon system improvements? And now, there's a very special situation that undoubtedly has happened to you multiple times in your career. I call this the hot potato problem. Now, what is the hot potato? It's something where you're like in your normal development cycle. In your process, you're mid-sprint or you're at the beginning of your sprint, and suddenly that hot new potato comes. There's an urgency, something that can be postponed, that comes from top of the food chain, like CEO. It's something that cannot be ignored. But at the same time, there's no room being created for it. There's no talks about deprioritizing other issues. Everything is urgent. Now, what we have here is a time and responsibility relationship. The more time you spend not raising this up to the decision makers in your company, is the more responsible you become and feel. Given enough time, you will not be able to refuse not doing this amount of work because you feel it's your responsibility to deliver. Because you are part of the cause. So when you do raise this issue to your decision makers, I'd like to suggest that you use a technique from NLP called framing. You should explain the situation, right? The problem is the situation, and please make sure to tell them that the goal here is for you to help them, right? You want to help them resolve the issue, but it's something that needs their attention, right? You have some constraints, and this is where you need to learn your numbers, right? You have a set amount of people in the team, you have a limited availability of how much they can work overtime, if at all. Obviously, there's the problem of overheating or burning out in the extremes, right? If people work overtime, like in an engine, the more they heat up, the more it takes to cool down. So 2 to 3 sprints or whatever period, they're not going to be functioning at full capacity. And obviously, there's impact on future plans. These people are usually very experienced, and that's their job description. You should give them the data and the opportunity to handle the issue after you explain the constraints you have. All right. So we've talked a fair deal about how to mitigate technical debt. Let's try and prevent it in the first place. And as always, or as before, with mitigating it, I propose a strategy. First, we need to discover the issues early on, and these can be implemented with automation tools, code static analysis tools. There's a bunch of services, there's a bunch of tools out there to help you, and I'll even have a list further on in the talk. But what this discovery mechanism does is allow you to make a decision. Is it something that you can live with? Is it something that you can mitigate down the line? Or is it something that you can refuse? And this brings us to the culture in our teams, right? You've heard probably very often a term called fail fast. And I would like to suggest something different. I'd like you to learn fast, not fail fast, because failing is never the objective. Learning is. Never add intentional mess, right? So if you can do things or bring order from chaos, do not approve more debt where applicable, where possible, obviously. And please remember the key concept that everybody that's maybe non-technical looks at you with, right? So quality, in their point of view, is a fundamental part of what you deliver, and it's your responsibility, right? But that fundamental part cannot be delivered under every circumstance, and that needs to be said with clarity to people. You need also to take a strategic design decision, right? A system cannot have the same amount of quality everywhere, right? You cannot have your CMS, I mean, it doesn't have any sense to have your CMS at 100% code coverage when your checkout payment system is at 10. Obviously, you should focus on the critical business logic in your applications, and you should strive for good practices. And that would be test-driven development, clean code, agile methodologies as a process, peer review, and monitoring that we discussed before with automatic code review tools if possible. That usually helps. There's different tools for security, and I'm just going to mention a few here. Don't worry, you don't have to screenshot this. You're going to receive the presentation later on. Some notable ones: Codacy, CodeBit, Code Climate, Scrutinizer, and this by far is not a complete list, right? And obviously, if you have some more stringent security requirements, please look into something like SonarQube. But instead of me trying to list them all here, this GitHub repo has an awesome list for each language, and they're updated constantly. So let's try and summarize what we've been discussing here. We've been discussing about why should you care about technical debt, what it really is, and what are its causes. How do we mitigate it, and not lastly, how to prevent it. I'd like you to choose one thing we've been discussing about today that you feel would add the greatest value in your team, and take action now. Thank you. If you have some questions, please do use the Zoom's functionality here. I'm going to try and answer a few of them right here. And if there are a bit more, I will be answering them after the presentation. What method do you prefer? This is Mihai. What method do you prefer to do root cause analysis? Have you used the fishbone method? No, I haven't used the fishbone method, but honestly, it's usually a talk between the most senior technical people in that organization, and it's just a discussion about why is it really failing. It's more like a brainstorm from my experience, but I'll have to look the fishbone method up. Yeronim, how do you explain to the customer the missed implementations of the new features? Features that were not agreed in the initial state of the project. Well, I guess this is more of a process issue. Your Scrum Master needs to raise this early with the client. You should try and ensure that there's a fair trade between what the customer wants and what the customer requested initially. This has to be a swap. You can't do two things at once and the same time at the same quality. Benoit, is there any tools to estimate technical debt? Well, yeah, when it comes to code, absolutely. The type of tools you have there, static code analysis, analyzing the psychometric complexity and all that, they're very, very helpful. Where they're not helpful is where you, for the other types, right? You need an audit or a review to see what you have to do there, right? Because what documentation do we have? Is it up to date? Is this a good design for our application use case? Like what data store are we using? So on and so forth. All right. I hope I'm saying this name right or no. From your experience, what is the percentage of extra time to take and not add too much technical debt? Well, first, that's a very good question. I think it's closely coupled with good practices and some good decisions. I'm talking about the type 1 decisions, the type of decisions that you cannot reverse easily, sometimes not at all. And I would say that ensuring that type of quality is usually about 30 or 50% of the development time. Gabriela, any suggestions about tools to identify technical debt in the code? Yes, when you receive the slides, there's going to be a GitHub repo link with some awesome static code analysis tools. And depending on your technology or even your framework for what you're using, you'll have a choice there to start playing around with and seeing some metrics. All right, so thank you very much for your time. And have a nice day. We'll see you in the next one.